The morning sun blazed over the Coronado Naval Base as Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez walked across the training grounds, her boots crunching on the sandy concrete. At 34, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every stripe on her uniform through years of dedication and excellence. Her dark hair was pulled back in regulation style, and her eyes held the sharp focus of a seasoned military professional. Today would mark the beginning of something unprecedented in Navy SEAL training history. Sarah had received the call 3 weeks earlier while stationed at the Naval War College in Newport. The voice on the other end belonged to Captain Robert Hayes, commanding officer of the Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training Program. His tone carried both urgency and uncertainty as he explained the situation. The Navy was implementing a new phase in SEAL training focused on advanced tactical psychology and adaptive leadership under extreme stress. They needed an instructor who could challenge these elite warriors in ways they had never experienced before. What made this assignment extraordinary wasn't just the subject matter, but the fact that Sarah would be the first woman to directly instruct Navy SEALs in a combat-related discipline. The decision had sparked intense debate among the military hierarchy. Some questioned whether the SEALs would accept instruction from someone who hadn't endured the grueling Hell Week or carried a weapon in direct combat. Others argued that bringing in an outsider perspective, especially someone with Sarah's unique qualifications, could revolutionize how the military's most elite forces approached mental resilience. Sarah's background made her an unconventional choice that somehow made perfect sense. She held a doctorate in behavioral psychology with a specialization in high-stress decision-making. Her military career had taken her through intelligence operations in 3 different theaters, where she had analyzed enemy behavior patterns and developed psychological profiles that had saved countless lives. She had also spent 2 years embedded with special operations units as a psychological operations specialist, though never in direct combat roles. The controversy surrounding her appointment had reached her ears long before she arrived at Coronado. Stories filtered back through military channels about heated discussions in briefing rooms and skeptical conversations among SEAL instructors. Some questioned whether the legendary warriors would even show up to her sessions. Others wondered if this was simply a political move designed to demonstrate the Navy's commitment to gender integration without making any real changes to operational units. Sarah understood the skepticism, but she also knew something her critics didn't. During her years analyzing elite military units, she had identified patterns of thinking that even the most highly trained warriors fell into under extreme pressure. These cognitive shortcuts, while often effective, sometimes led to predictable responses that enemies could exploit. Her mission wasn't to challenge the SEALs' physical capabilities or their proven tactical skills. Instead, she aimed to push them beyond their mental comfort zones in ways that would make them more unpredictable and adaptable in real combat situations. The training facility buzzed with activity as morning preparations began. SEAL instructors moved with purpose, setting up equipment and reviewing schedules. Sarah noticed how conversations quieted when she passed, replaced by polite nods and careful professional courtesy. The tension wasn't hostile, but it was definitely present. These men had dedicated their lives to an exclusive brotherhood built on shared suffering and mutual trust. Having an outsider, especially a woman, step into their sacred space challenged fundamental assumptions about their community. Class 237 consisted of 24 candidates who had already survived the initial phases of SEAL training. These weren't fresh recruits struggling with basic military discipline. They were hardened individuals who had endured months of physical and mental torture designed to weed out all but the most determined. They had crawled through mud under live gunfire, held their breath underwater until their lungs burned, and pushed their bodies to limits most people couldn't imagine. Each had proven his ability to function effectively when exhausted, cold, hungry, and stressed beyond normal human endurance. Sarah had studied their files extensively. Among the group were former college athletes, military veterans from other branches, and civilians who had given up promising careers to pursue the ultimate military challenge. Their ages ranged from 22 to 31, and their backgrounds varied widely, but they all shared certain characteristics. Intelligence scores placed them in the top percentiles. Physical fitness tests showed capabilities far beyond normal military standards. Psychological evaluations revealed the kind of mental toughness that allowed people to continue functioning when others would break down completely. What intrigued Sarah most about studying their profiles wasn't their strengths, but the subtle patterns in their thinking processes. Years of military training had conditioned them to approach problems in specific ways. They excelled at breaking down complex situations into manageable components, following established procedures under pressure, and maintaining focus despite distractions. These were valuable skills that had served them well throughout their training. However, Sarah suspected that this same structured thinking might create blind spots in certain types of scenarios. The first meeting was scheduled for 0800 hours in Building 164, a nondescript concrete structure that housed various training classrooms. Sarah arrived 30 minutes early to set up her materials and prepare the room. She had chosen not to use traditional military teaching aids like PowerPoint presentations or technical manuals. Instead, her equipment consisted of simple props that might seem out of place in a military environment: colored cards, small puzzles, everyday objects that could be found in any civilian setting. Her preparation routine included reviewing her notes one final time and running through mental exercises designed to maintain calm focus regardless of external pressure. Sarah had learned long ago that the key to commanding respect in challenging situations wasn't to prove superiority, but to demonstrate competence and maintain composure while others tested boundaries. She expected the SEALs to challenge her authority in various ways, probably starting with subtle tests to gauge her reactions. At exactly 0800, the candidates filed into the classroom with military precision. They moved with the controlled confidence of men accustomed to dangerous situations, each taking a seat without unnecessary conversation or movement. Their eyes swept the room, automatically assessing exits, potential threats, and anything unusual about their environment. Sarah noted their body language, the way they positioned themselves to maintain visual contact with both her and the door, and how they seemed to communicate through brief glances and almost imperceptible gestures. The silence stretched for several seconds as 24 pairs of eyes focused on her with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and professional assessment. Sarah had experienced similar moments before when walking into rooms full of people who questioned her presence. The key was to acknowledge the tension without being intimidated by it, to demonstrate confidence without appearing arrogant, and to establish credibility through actions rather than words. She began without introduction, launching directly into an exercise that caught everyone off guard. You have 30 seconds to arrange yourselves in height order from tallest to shortest without speaking, pointing, or making any sounds, she announced, her voice carrying clearly across the room. Your time starts now. The challenge immediately disrupted their careful seating arrangement and forced them to move, interact, and problem-solve as a group. Sarah watched as they hesitated briefly, then began standing and attempting to organize themselves through subtle gestures and positioning. The exercise seemed simple on the surface, but it actually required rapid assessment, nonverbal communication, and adaptation when initial assumptions proved incorrect. Some candidates immediately took charge, trying to organize others through hand signals and body language. Others stepped back to observe before committing to positions. A few attempted to measure themselves against walls or furniture to determine relative heights more accurately. The 30-second time limit created pressure that forced quick decisions and prevented extended deliberation. Time, Sarah called exactly 30 seconds later. The group had managed a rough approximation of height order, though several obvious mistakes were visible. Interesting, she continued, making notes on her clipboard. You approached that as a logistics problem requiring leadership and coordination. You assumed the goal was perfect accuracy within the time limit. You organized yourselves the way you would organize any military unit facing a time-sensitive mission. Several candidates exchanged glances, clearly wondering where this observation was leading. Sarah could sense their mental gears turning as they tried to predict her next move or understand the purpose of the exercise. This uncertainty was exactly what she wanted to create. SEAL training typically involved challenges with clear objectives and established criteria for success or failure. Her approach would be different. Now we're going to do it again, she announced, but this time, the goal is in height order. Your goal is to surprise me. You have the same 30 seconds, the same restrictions on communication, but your success will be measured by how creatively you interpret the challenge. Begin. This second iteration produced completely different results. Instead of focusing on height arrangement, the candidates began experimenting with various formations and approaches. Some sat down to change their relative heights. Others formed geometric patterns or spelling out letters with their bodies. A few deliberately created chaos that looked disorganized but followed internal logic that only they understood. The shift in their behavior fascinated Sarah because it demonstrated something crucial about human psychology under pressure. When given a clear, measurable objective, they performed exactly as their training had prepared them to perform. When the parameters changed and success became subjective rather than objective, they had to abandon familiar approaches and think creatively in real time. "Much better," she said when time expired. "But I notice you're still thinking in terms of group coordination and shared objectives. You're trying to surprise me as a unit rather than considering individual approaches to the challenge." One of the candidates, a stocky man with close-cropped blonde hair, raised his hand slightly. Sarah nodded for him to speak. "Ma'am, with respect, what does this have to do with SEAL training?" His tone was polite but carried an undertone of challenge that rippled through the room. "What's your name?" Sarah asked. "Petty Officer Harrison, ma'am." "Good question, Harrison. Tell me, in your previous training, how many times were you presented with problems that had no clear solution or where the definition of success kept changing while you worked?" Harrison considered this carefully before responding. "Most scenarios had defined objectives, ma'am. Even when conditions changed, the mission parameters stayed consistent." "Exactly," Sarah replied. "But real combat situations don't always provide that clarity. Sometimes the enemy changes tactics in ways that make your original mission irrelevant. Sometimes local conditions create opportunities that weren't part of the initial plan. Sometimes success means recognizing when your training doesn't apply and improvising something completely different." She moved to the whiteboard and began sketching a simple diagram showing interconnected circles and arrows. "Your previous training has made you exceptionally good at executing complex operations under extreme pressure. You can follow detailed plans, adapt to changing conditions within defined parameters, and maintain performance when others would break down. These are valuable capabilities that separate you from conventional military units." The candidates listened intently as Sarah continued her explanation. "However, that same training has also created certain patterns in how you approach problems. You tend to look for the tactical solution, the efficient path, the approach that minimizes risk while maximizing probability of success. These tendencies served you well during selection and training, but they can become limitations when facing truly unpredictable situations." Another candidate, a tall African-American man with intelligent eyes, spoke up without raising his hand. "Are you suggesting our training is inadequate?" "Not inadequate," Sarah corrected. "Incomplete. Your training has prepared you to be the best possible version of what a Navy SEAL has traditionally been. My job is to push you beyond those traditional boundaries, to help you develop capabilities that haven't been part of SEAL training before." The room buzzed with subtle tension as her words sank in. Sarah could see skepticism mixing with curiosity in their faces. These men had sacrificed enormous amounts to reach this point in their training. They had endured physical and mental challenges that would destroy most people, and they took pride in belonging to an elite community with decades of proven success. Having someone suggest that this proven system needed expansion challenged their fundamental assumptions about their own preparation. "Let me give you a concrete example," Sarah continued, sensing the need to ground her abstract concepts in practical terms. "Last year, a SEAL team in Afghanistan encountered a situation where their primary mission became impossible due to unexpected civilian presence in the target area. Standard protocol required them to abort and extract. Instead, they improvised a completely different approach that required them to blend in with local population, gather intelligence through social interaction, and ultimately achieve their objective through methods that aren't covered in any SEAL training manual." She let this example sink in before continuing. "The team succeeded because they were able to think beyond their tactical training and adapt to circumstances that no one had prepared them for. But they succeeded despite their training, not because of it. My goal is to develop those adaptive capabilities as a trained skill rather than leaving them to chance." Sarah could see the candidates processing this information, their professional minds analyzing her argument and looking for flaws or areas of agreement. Several exchanged glances that suggested internal conversations about whether her perspective had merit. Others maintained neutral expressions that revealed nothing about their thoughts. Over the next 4 weeks, she announced, we're going to explore scenarios that can't be solved through conventional SEAL tactics. You'll face problems where physical superiority is irrelevant, where standard procedures don't apply, and where success requires you to think in ways that military training typically discourages. Some of you will find this frustrating because it challenges assumptions you've held about effective problem solving. Others will discover capabilities you didn't know you possessed. Harrison raised his hand again. Ma'am, how do we measure success if the parameters keep changing? Sarah smiled, recognizing the intelligence behind his question. That's precisely the point, Harrison. In real combat, success isn't always measured against predetermined criteria. Sometimes you only recognize success after the fact, when you realize you achieved something valuable that wasn't part of your original plan. Learning to operate effectively in that kind of ambiguous environment is exactly what we're here to develop. The session continued with several more exercises designed to disrupt normal thinking patterns and force creative adaptation. Sarah introduced challenges that required collaboration between people with conflicting objectives, problems that could only be solved by deliberately ignoring obvious solutions, and scenarios where the most logical approach led to failure while counterintuitive strategies produced success. Throughout these exercises, she observed not just how the candidates performed, but how they reacted to performing poorly. SEAL training had conditioned them to view failure as unacceptable, something to be avoided through superior preparation and execution. Sarah's exercises deliberately created situations where initial failure was inevitable, where learning required experimentation and iteration rather than flawless performance. The candidates' reactions varied significantly. Some became visibly frustrated when their standard approaches didn't work, their jaw muscles tightening and their movements becoming more forceful. Others maintained outward calm while clearly struggling internally with the ambiguity of unclear success criteria. A few seemed energized by the novel challenges, their eyes lighting up as they engaged with problems that required completely different kinds of thinking. As the session drew to a close, Sarah could sense the mixture of confusion, curiosity, and skepticism that filled the room. These men had expected their first encounter with the mysterious female instructor to follow familiar patterns. Either she would prove herself worthy of their respect through demonstrating superior knowledge and capability, or she would reveal herself as unqualified for her position through obvious mistakes or lack of understanding. Instead, she had created an entirely different kind of experience that didn't fit into their established categories. Her exercises hadn't tested their existing skills or challenged them to perform better within familiar parameters. Rather, she had introduced them to types of problems they hadn't encountered before and suggested that their proven capabilities might sometimes be obstacles rather than advantages. Your homework for tonight, Sarah announced as she gathered her materials, is to identify one assumption about effective problem solving that you've never questioned. Don't try to challenge it or change it. Just recognize something you've always taken for granted about the right way to approach difficult situations. We'll discuss these assumptions tomorrow. The candidates file out of the classroom in small groups, their conversations subdued but intense. Sarah could hear fragments of discussion about the morning's exercises and speculation about what the rest of the course would involve. Some voices carried notes of skepticism, others curiosity, and a few showed signs of genuine excitement about exploring unfamiliar mental territory. Sarah remained in the classroom after everyone left, reviewing her notes and planning adjustments for the next session. The first encounter had gone exactly as she had hoped. She had established that this course would be different from anything in their previous experience, introduced concepts that challenged their fundamental assumptions about problem solving, and created enough uncertainty to keep them engaged without overwhelming them with completely foreign ideas. The real work would begin tomorrow, when she started pushing them beyond their mental comfort zones in ways that would reveal both the strengths and limitations of their current thinking patterns. Some would resist these challenges, clinging to proven methods that had served them well throughout their military careers. Others would embrace the opportunity to develop new capabilities that could make them more effective in unpredictable situations. Sarah understood that her success wouldn't be measured by how well the candidates performed in her exercises, but by how effectively she could expand their mental toolkit without undermining their confidence in their existing capabilities. The goal wasn't to replace their tactical training with psychological theory, but to add new dimensions to their thinking that would make them more adaptable and unpredictable in real combat situations. As she walked back across the training grounds toward her temporary quarters, Sarah reflected on the challenge ahead. She was attempting something that had never been tried before, introducing advanced psychological concepts to individuals who had been selected and trained for their ability to follow established procedures under extreme pressure. The balance between pushing them beyond their comfort zones and maintaining their respect for her expertise would require constant adjustment based on their responses and progress. The next 3 weeks would determine whether her unconventional approach could actually enhance the capabilities of the military's most elite warriors, or whether the gap between psychological theory and practical combat application was too great to bridge effectively. The second week of Sarah's unconventional training program began with an exercise that would test everything the SEAL candidates thought they knew about leadership and decision-making. Sarah had spent the weekend analyzing each candidate's responses from the previous week, identifying individual thinking patterns and group dynamics that would shape her approach going forward. She arrived at the training facility before dawn, setting up equipment in the main courtyard rather than the familiar classroom environment. Today's challenge would take place outdoors, under conditions that more closely resembled real operational scenarios. The morning air carried the salt smell of the nearby ocean and the distant sounds of standard SEAL training activities from other parts of the base. Petty Officer Harrison had been particularly vocal during the previous week's sessions, consistently questioning the relevance of Sarah's exercises to actual combat situations. His skepticism had begun influencing other candidates, creating an undercurrent of resistance that threatened to undermine the entire program. Rather than addressing this challenge directly through confrontation or authority, Sarah had designed today's exercise specifically to demonstrate why conventional thinking patterns could become liabilities in unpredictable situations. At 0600 hours, the 24 candidates assembled in the courtyard, their faces showing the alertness that comes from military conditioning but also traces of uncertainty about what Sarah might have planned. They had learned during the previous week that her exercises rarely followed predictable patterns or conventional training methodologies. Today we're going to explore decision-making under pressure, Sarah announced, gesturing toward a complex arrangement of equipment she had set up across the courtyard. But, first, I need to divide you into 4 teams of 6 people each. You have 2 minutes to organize yourselves into groups that you believe will be most effective for completing unknown challenges. The candidates immediately began forming teams based on their natural relationships and previous experiences working together. Best friends paired up, people with complementary skills gravitated toward each other, and informal leaders quickly emerged to coordinate group selection. Within 90 seconds, 4 teams had formed with relatively equal numbers and what appeared to be balanced capabilities. Interesting choices, Sarah observed as she walked between the teams. You organized yourselves based on existing relationships and perceived skill compatibility. Each team has a mix of physical capabilities, technical expertise, and leadership experience. You've essentially created 4 versions of ideal SEAL units scaled down to 6-person teams. She paused in front of Harrison's team, which included several of the most vocal skeptics from previous sessions. Harrison, explain your team's selection strategy. Ma'am, we focused on complementary skills and proven ability to work together under pressure. Each team member brings different strengths, and we've worked together in previous training exercises. Logical approach, Sarah acknowledged. Anyone disagree with that strategy? Silence filled the courtyard as candidates waited to see where this discussion might lead. Sarah had learned that direct questions often revealed more about their thinking processes than elaborate exercises. The first challenge is simple, she continued, moving to a table covered with various ordinary objects, kitchen utensils, office supplies, children's toys, and household items that seemed completely out of place in a military training environment. Each team needs to select one item from this table that will be essential for completing today's mission. You have 30 seconds to choose, and once you choose, you cannot change your selection. The teams huddled quickly, intense whispered conversations erupting as they tried to guess what kind of challenge might require household objects. Most teams gravitated toward items that seemed most likely to have practical utility: rope, flashlights, multi-tools, or containers that might hold water or other supplies. Harrison's team selected a sturdy camping knife, reasoning that cutting tools had universal applicability in survival and tactical situations. Two other teams chose similar practical items, while the fourth team surprised everyone by selecting a bright red rubber ball that seemed completely useless for any serious military purpose. "Excellent," Sarah said, making notes on her clipboard. "Now I'll explain today's scenario. Each team represents a different SEAL unit that has been inserted into a hostile urban environment. Your mission is to extract a high-value target from a building controlled by enemy forces. However, there's a complication that intelligence didn't anticipate." She led them toward the far end of the courtyard where she had constructed a maze-like arrangement of barriers, walls, and obstacles that simulated an urban environment. The construction was impressive in its detail, with multiple levels, hiding places, and pathways that created a complex three-dimensional puzzle. "The target is located in the center of this structure," Sarah explained, pointing toward a red flag visible in the middle of the maze. "However, the building is filled with children from a local school that was being used as a cover for enemy operations. Any approach that might endanger civilian children will result in mission failure and international incident that destroys years of diplomatic progress." The candidates studied the maze carefully, their professional minds automatically analyzing sightlines, potential approaches, and tactical considerations. The structure was designed to make conventional military approaches extremely difficult without risking harm to hypothetical civilians scattered throughout the area. "Additional complication," Sarah continued. "Enemy forces have installed pressure-sensitive alarms throughout the structure. Any footstep that exceeds normal civilian walking pressure will trigger building-wide alerts that result in hostage execution and target elimination. You must move through the environment using only the style and pressure of casual pedestrian movement." Harrison raised his hand. "Ma'am, what exactly constitutes casual pedestrian movement?" "Good question," Sarah replied. "Watch carefully." She demonstrated by walking across a marked area with relaxed, unhurried steps that looked completely natural and non-threatening. No military bearing, no tactical positioning, no rapid movements or sudden direction changes. You must move as if you're ordinary civilians taking an evening stroll through a peaceful neighborhood. The candidates immediately recognized the challenge this presented. Years of military training had conditioned them to move with purpose, maintain tactical awareness, and position themselves for maximum effectiveness in threatening situations. Forcing themselves to adopt casual civilian movement patterns would require them to suppress every instinct their training had developed. "Your selected items will be crucial for mission success," Sarah added, "but not necessarily in ways you might expect. You have 15 minutes to study the structure and plan your approach. Then, each team will attempt the extraction while the others observe and learn from their successes or failures." The team spread out around the maze, examining the structure from different angles and engaging in intense planning discussions. Sarah watched their body language and conversation patterns, noting how each group approached the problem-solving process. Harrison's team immediately began applying conventional tactical analysis, identifying potential breach points, establishing overwatch positions, and planning coordinated movement patterns that would minimize exposure to hypothetical enemy fire. Their discussion focused on proven small unit tactics adapted to the unusual movement restrictions. The team that had selected the rubber ball took a completely different approach. Instead of analyzing the structure as a tactical problem, they began experimenting with ways their seemingly useless item might actually provide advantages in an environment where conventional military approaches were constrained. "What if the ball isn't meant to be a tool," suggested one team member, "but a way to change how we think about the problem entirely?" This observation led them down a path of creative thinking that the other teams hadn't considered. While the tactical teams focused on how to move through the maze efficiently while maintaining civilian movement patterns, the ball team began exploring whether the mission parameters allowed for completely non-military approaches to achieving their objective. When planning time expired, Sarah called the first team forward to attempt their extraction. Harrison's team approached the maze with careful precision, each member moving with studied casualness that looked awkward and unnatural despite their best efforts. Years of military conditioning made it nearly impossible for them to truly relax their bearing and adopt genuine civilian movement patterns. Their chosen knife proved useful for quietly cutting through certain barriers, and their tactical coordination allowed them to navigate the complex structure efficiently. However, their movement style remained recognizably military despite conscious efforts to appear casual. Sarah called alarm triggered twice during their attempt, indicating that their underlying tactical mindset had betrayed them through subtle cues in their positioning and movement patterns. They successfully reached the target and extracted it from the center of the maze, but their approach had resulted in theoretical civilian casualties and international complications that would have made their real-world mission a strategic failure despite achieving the immediate tactical objective. The second and third teams followed similar patterns, applying tactical expertise to navigate the physical challenges while struggling to truly abandon their military conditioning. Each team successfully extracted the target, and each team triggered multiple alarms through movement patterns that revealed their training despite conscious efforts to appear civilian. The fourth team, with their rubber ball, approached the entire scenario differently. Instead of treating it as a tactical problem that required infiltration and extraction, they began by asking whether the mission parameters actually required them to enter the maze at all. "What exactly does extract the high-value target mean?" asked their informal leader, a quiet man named Rodriguez who had rarely spoken during previous sessions. "Does it require us to physically enter the building and escort the target out? Or does it just require us to get the target away from enemy control?" Sarah smiled slightly but didn't provide clarification, forcing the team to interpret the mission parameters based on their own analysis and assumptions. Rodriguez's team began experimenting with their rubber ball, testing whether they could use it to establish communication with the theoretical target without entering the dangerous maze environment. They developed a system of bouncing the ball off strategic surfaces to create coded messages that might allow them to coordinate with their target from outside the structure. Their approach revealed fundamental assumptions that the other teams had made without realizing it. Everyone had automatically assumed that extraction required infiltration, that success meant applying tactical skills to overcome physical obstacles, and that their selected equipment needed to serve traditional utility functions. When Rodriguez's team attempted their extraction, they positioned themselves outside the maze and used their ball to create a series of carefully timed bounces that formed a crude communication system. They had reasoned that if the target was truly high value, they would likely have some intelligence training and might be able to interpret simple coded messages. After several minutes of patient signaling, they called out "target extracted." Sarah raised her eyebrows and asked them to explain their approach. Rodriguez described how they had used the ball to communicate escape routes and timing to their theoretical target, allowing the target to extract themselves while the team provided external security and guidance. "But how do you know the target received and understood your messages?" Sarah asked. "We don't, ma'am," Rodriguez admitted. "But the mission parameters didn't require us to verify communication, only to extract the target. If our approach failed, we would try conventional infiltration as a backup plan. But if it succeeded, we would achieve the objective without risking civilian casualties or triggering security systems." The other candidates listened with growing interest as Rodriguez explained their reasoning. His team had identified unstated assumptions that everyone else had made about the nature of the mission, questioned whether those assumptions were actually necessary, and developed an approach that minimized risk while potentially achieving the same objective. Sarah gathered all four teams together for debriefing, using their different approaches to illustrate key concepts about tactical thinking versus creative problem solving. "Harrison, your team demonstrated excellent tactical skills and effective use of your selected equipment," she began. "Your approach would have succeeded in many real-world scenarios where civilian considerations were less critical and stealth requirements were less stringent. However, you approached the problem through the lens of how SEALs typically operate, adapting your proven methods to unusual constraints rather than questioning whether those methods were appropriate for this specific situation." Harrison nodded thoughtfully, his earlier skepticism beginning to give way to genuine engagement with the concepts Sarah was presenting. "Rodriguez, your team approached the same scenario by questioning fundamental assumptions about what success required," Sarah continued. "You recognized that the mission objective might be achievable through methods that weren't covered in your tactical training, and you developed an approach that minimized risk while potentially achieving the same result." She moved to the whiteboard and began diagramming the different thinking processes each team had demonstrated. Both approaches have value in different situations. Tactical excellence and proven procedures provide reliable solutions to most military challenges. But creative problem-solving and assumption questioning become crucial when facing scenarios that don't fit established patterns. One of the candidates from the second team raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we know when to apply tactical thinking versus creative thinking?" "Outstanding question," Sarah replied. "That's exactly the kind of situational awareness we're here to develop. In real combat situations, you need to rapidly assess whether your current scenario matches patterns you've trained for, or whether it requires approaches you've never practiced." She spent the next hour walking them through various scenarios where each type of thinking would be most appropriate, helping them develop frameworks for recognizing when to rely on proven methods and when to explore untested approaches. The session continued with several more exercises designed to force rapid switching between tactical and creative thinking modes. Sarah introduced time pressure, conflicting information, and changing mission parameters that required constant adaptation and re-evaluation of initial assumptions. During one particularly challenging exercise, candidates had to coordinate rescue operations while receiving contradictory intelligence updates every few minutes. Success required them to maintain tactical effectiveness while remaining flexible enough to completely change their approach when new information made their original plans obsolete. Harrison's performance during these exercises revealed the internal struggle he was experiencing. His tactical instincts and leadership capabilities were clearly exceptional, but he was beginning to recognize situations where those same strengths might become limitations if applied inflexibly. "This is harder than Hell Week in some ways," he confided to Sarah during a brief break. "Physical challenges push your body to its limits, but you know what success looks like and you know that superior effort and determination will get you there. These mental challenges keep changing the definition of success while you're working toward it." Sarah recognized this as a breakthrough moment in Harrison's understanding of what she was trying to accomplish. "That's exactly right," she told him. Physical training builds capabilities that remain consistent across different situations. Mental flexibility training builds capabilities that must constantly adapt to changing circumstances. It's a different kind of strength that complements rather than replaces your tactical skills. As the day progressed, Sarah noticed significant changes in how the candidates approached new challenges. Instead of immediately defaulting to tactical analysis, they began asking questions about unstated assumptions and exploring whether conventional approaches were actually appropriate for each specific scenario. The rubber ball exercise had become a turning point in the group dynamic. Rodriguez's team had demonstrated that unconventional thinking could achieve tactical objectives through methods that no amount of traditional training would have suggested. This created curiosity about what other blind spots might exist in their standard approaches. During the final exercise of the day, Sarah presented them with a scenario that appeared to require conventional small unit tactics but actually contained hidden elements that made tactical success impossible without creative adaptation. The candidates who had initially been most skeptical about her methods now approached the problem with genuine openness to non-traditional solutions. Tomorrow we'll explore how these concepts apply to leadership and decision-making in complex environments, Sarah announced as the session concluded. Tonight's assignment is to identify one situation from your previous military experience where creative thinking might have produced better results than the tactical approach you actually used. The candidates filed out of the courtyard with expressions that showed mental exhaustion different from physical fatigue. Sarah had pushed them to exercise mental muscles they hadn't known they possessed, forcing them to question assumptions and explore thinking patterns that their training had never addressed. That evening, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her quarters. Harrison knocked on her door shortly after dinner, his usual confident demeanor replaced by thoughtful uncertainty. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology," he began when she invited him in. "I've been questioning your methods and your qualifications since the first day, assuming that civilian academic training couldn't provide insights relevant to military operations." Sarah listened carefully as Harrison explained his changing perspective on the value of psychological training for elite military units. "Today's exercises showed me that my tactical training, as valuable as it is, has also created blind spots that could be exploited by enemies who understand how SEALs typically think and operate," he continued. I'm starting to realize that expanding our mental toolkit might be just as important as perfecting our physical and tactical capabilities. This conversation confirmed what Sarah had hoped would happen during the second week of training. The initial resistance and skepticism were giving way to genuine curiosity and recognition that mental flexibility could enhance rather than replace their existing skills. The real test would come during the following weeks, when she introduced even more challenging concepts that would push them beyond their comfort zones in ways that tested not just their thinking patterns, but their fundamental beliefs about leadership, teamwork, and mission success. The third week of Sarah's program began with news that sent shockwaves through the entire SEAL training community. A classified report had leaked suggesting that her unconventional methods were producing measurable improvements in candidate performance during simulated operations. Word of these results had reached senior Navy leadership, creating both supporters and critics who demanded immediate evaluation of her program's effectiveness. Captain Hayes called Sarah to his office early Monday morning, his expression serious as he explained the political pressure building around her experimental training methods. Pentagon officials wanted concrete evidence that psychological training could enhance SEAL capabilities without undermining the proven selection and training systems that had produced elite warriors for decades. You have 10 days to demonstrate that your approach produces superior results compared to traditional methods, Hayes informed her. The Navy is planning a comprehensive evaluation that will determine whether psychological training becomes a permanent part of SEAL preparation or whether this experiment gets terminated immediately. Sarah understood the implications of this deadline. Success would validate her belief that mental flexibility could enhance elite military capabilities. Failure would end her career in military training and potentially set back efforts to incorporate psychological insights into special operations preparation for years. She returned to her quarters that morning to find an encrypted message from the Pentagon requesting detailed performance data on each candidate in her program. Military psychologists and tactical experts were being assembled to evaluate her methods against traditional training approaches through controlled testing that would begin immediately. The pressure of external evaluation created new dynamics within her class that Sarah hadn't anticipated. Candidates who had begun embracing creative thinking approaches now faced the possibility that their experimental training might be replaced by conventional methods if Sarah couldn't prove its superiority quickly enough. Harrison approached her before the morning session, his earlier enthusiasm tempered by concern about how the evaluation might affect his own career prospects. "Ma'am, if this program gets cancelled, will our participation be viewed negatively by future instructors and commanding officers?" It was a legitimate concern that Sarah had been wrestling with herself. SEAL candidates had invested enormous amounts in reaching this point in their training. Any association with failed experimental programs could potentially damage their prospects for successful completion and future assignments. "I can't make promises about how others will view your participation," Sarah told him honestly. "But I can tell you that the capabilities you're developing here will make you more effective warriors regardless of whether the Navy officially recognizes their value." She had designed this week's exercises to push the candidates beyond anything they had experienced during the previous 2 weeks. If external evaluation was going to determine the program's future, she would ensure that evaluators saw the full potential of what psychological training could accomplish. The morning session began in the base's simulation facility, a high-tech environment normally used for advanced tactical training. Sarah had arranged for the candidates to face scenarios that would be recorded and analyzed by Pentagon evaluation teams, creating added pressure that would test both their newly developed mental flexibility and their ability to perform under intense scrutiny. "Today you'll face missions that require you to integrate tactical excellence with creative problem-solving under conditions where failure has real consequences for your careers and this program's future," Sarah announced. External evaluators will be analyzing your performance to determine whether psychological training provides advantages over conventional preparation methods. The weight of this responsibility settled over the candidates like a heavy blanket. They were no longer just learning new skills or exploring different thinking approaches. They had become test subjects whose performance would determine whether future SEAL classes would benefit from psychological training or continue with purely tactical preparation. Sarah had constructed scenarios specifically designed to showcase the advantages of mental flexibility while requiring the tactical skills that conventional training had developed. Each exercise would be impossible to complete successfully using either purely tactical or purely creative approaches alone, forcing candidates to demonstrate integration of both skill sets. The first scenario placed teams in an urban environment where they needed to gather intelligence from hostile populations while maintaining cover identities that required them to act completely contrary to their military training. Success required them to suppress every behavioral pattern that identified them as trained warriors while still accomplishing tactical objectives. Rodriguez's team, which had shown the most creativity during previous exercises, volunteered to attempt the first mission while other teams observed, and Pentagon evaluators recorded their performance through hidden cameras and microphones. The scenario required them to pose as international aid workers conducting humanitarian assessments in a war zone while actually gathering intelligence on enemy movements and capabilities. They had to convince trained actors playing hostile locals that they were genuine civilians while obtaining military information that could only be acquired through careful questioning and observation. The mission proved extraordinarily difficult because it required them to simultaneously maintain perfect civilian personas while applying tactical awareness to detect threats and opportunities that civilians wouldn't notice. Any slip in their cover identities would result in mission failure and theoretical capture or execution. Rodriguez demonstrated remarkable adaptation during the early phases of the mission. His team had learned to suppress their military bearings so effectively that they genuinely appeared to be concerned humanitarian workers. However, when faced with a situation that threatened one of his teammates, his protective instincts overrode his civilian persona and revealed his military training to the hostile actors. The evaluators noted this breakdown in documentation that would be forwarded to Pentagon decision-makers. Sarah watched with growing concern as she realized that the artificial pressure of career-defining evaluation might actually impede the candidates' ability to demonstrate the capabilities they had been developing. Harrison's team attempted the next scenario, which required them to infiltrate a diplomatic reception and obtain sensitive information through social interaction and observation rather than conventional intelligence-gathering methods. Success depended on their ability to charm, manipulate, and extract information from sophisticated targets who would be trained to detect military personnel operating undercover. This mission pushed them into territory that had never been covered in their tactical training. They needed to master social skills, emotional manipulation, and psychological profiling in real time while maintaining perfect operational security. The challenge was further complicated by the knowledge that Pentagon evaluators were analyzing their every word and gesture for evidence of program effectiveness. Harrison's natural leadership abilities translated surprisingly well into social manipulation scenarios. He demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to build rapport with targets, guide conversations toward valuable information, and maintain his cover identity even under direct questioning. However, other team members struggled with the emotional demands of deception and psychological manipulation that effective social intelligence gathering required. One candidate, Petty Officer Matthews, experienced what appeared to be a psychological breakdown during the social infiltration exercise. The combination of performance pressure, unfamiliar skill requirements, and knowledge that his career depended on success created stress levels that overwhelmed his ability to function effectively. Sarah immediately called a halt to the exercise and removed Matthews from the evaluation scenario. She spent 30 minutes with him in a private debriefing session, helping him process the emotional impact of psychological manipulation training and exploring whether he needed additional support to continue with the program. "I've never felt anything like that," Matthews told her, his hands still shaking slightly from the intensity of his reaction. "During the social scenario, I felt like I was losing myself, like the deception was changing who I fundamentally am as a person. It wasn't just acting or playing a role. It felt like I was becoming someone I didn't recognize." Sarah recognized this as a predictable but serious response to psychological manipulation training. Some individuals experienced identity confusion when required to adopt personas that conflicted with their core values and self-image. Military training typically reinforced consistent identity and behavioral patterns, while psychological operations required fluid adaptation that could create internal conflicts. "This reaction tells us important information about your psychological profile," Sarah explained. "Some people can compartmentalize deception and manipulation as professional tools without experiencing personal impact. Others, like yourself, have stronger integration between their professional and personal identities that makes psychological manipulation emotionally costly." She helped Matthews understand that his reaction wasn't a sign of weakness or failure, but rather an indicator of personality characteristics that might make him more suitable for certain types of missions while less suitable for others. The goal of psychological training wasn't to turn everyone into expert manipulators, but to help each individual understand their own capabilities and limitations. However, Matthews' breakdown in full view of Pentagon evaluators created complications for the program's evaluation. Critics could point to psychological distress as evidence that Sarah's methods were harmful rather than beneficial, potentially undermining support for mental flexibility training. The afternoon evaluation session continued with scenarios designed to test leadership and decision-making under conditions where conventional military hierarchy and chain of command structures became obstacles rather than advantages. Candidates faced situations where success required them to ignore direct orders, abandon established procedures, and make decisions based on incomplete information that contradicted their tactical training. These scenarios pushed them into the most challenging territory Sarah had explored during the 3-week program. Military conditioning emphasized following orders, maintaining chain of command, and applying proven procedures even under extreme pressure. Psychological training suggested that rigid adherence to these principles could sometimes produce worse outcomes than flexible adaptation to specific circumstances. The candidates struggled visibly with exercises that required them to violate fundamental military principles in service of broader mission objectives. Years of conditioning had taught them that following orders and maintaining discipline were essential to unit effectiveness and personal survival. Being asked to deliberately break these rules, even in simulated scenarios, created internal conflicts that manifested in hesitation, second-guessing, and reduced performance. Pentagon evaluators documented these struggles as evidence that psychological training might undermine military discipline and unit cohesion. Sarah watched with growing frustration as external pressure and artificial evaluation conditions prevented the candidates from demonstrating the capabilities they had been developing during less stressful training sessions. By the end of the day, it had become clear that formal evaluation was creating dynamics that interfered with both learning and performance. The candidates were so focused on impressing evaluators and protecting their careers that they couldn't access the mental flexibility and creative thinking they had been practicing during previous weeks. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would define the remainder of her program and, potentially, her entire career. Instead of continuing with formal evaluation scenarios designed to impress Pentagon officials, she would return to the experiential learning methods that had been producing genuine capability development. She called an emergency meeting with all candidates in an informal setting away from cameras and recording equipment. "Tomorrow we're going to ignore the evaluators and focus on what we came here to accomplish," she announced. "I want you to forget about career implications and performance pressure. We're going to explore psychological concepts that will make you better warriors regardless of whether the Navy officially recognizes their value." Harrison raised his hand. "Ma'am, what about the evaluation deadline? If we don't demonstrate program effectiveness, won't that end psychological training for future candidates?" "Possibly," Sarah admitted. "But trying to perform for evaluators rather than learning for yourselves defeats the entire purpose of what we're doing here. Tomorrow we're going to focus on developing capabilities that will keep you alive and effective in real combat situations. If that impresses the Pentagon, excellent. If not, you'll still leave here with skills that could save your lives and the lives of your teammates." This decision created a turning point in the program's dynamics. Released from the pressure of formal evaluation, the candidates could once again focus on genuine learning and capability development rather than performance for external observers. The next morning, Sarah introduced the most challenging exercise of the entire program. Instead of simulated scenarios with predetermined objectives, she presented them with a completely open-ended mission that required them to define their own success criteria and develop their own approaches without any guidance or structure. "Your mission is to plan and execute an operation that demonstrates integration of tactical excellence with psychological flexibility," she announced. "You have complete freedom to define the objective, determine the methods, and establish the criteria for success. The only requirement is that your approach must utilize both conventional military skills and creative problem-solving in ways that neither could accomplish alone." This assignment forced them to synthesize everything they had learned during the previous 3 weeks while taking ownership of their own development in ways that traditional military training rarely allowed. Instead of following established procedures or adapting to instructor-defined challenges, they had to become their own instructors and create their own tests. The candidates spent hours planning approaches that would showcase their newly developed capabilities. Some teams focused on combining tactical infiltration with social engineering. Others explored integration of conventional weapons training with psychological manipulation of enemy behavior. Several groups developed scenarios that required rapid switching between military and civilian personas while maintaining operational effectiveness. Pentagon evaluators continued documenting their activities, but the artificial pressure of formal assessment had been replaced by genuine engagement with challenging concepts that the candidates found personally meaningful and professionally valuable. Rodriguez's team developed a scenario that required them to neutralize a threat through pure psychological manipulation without using any weapons or physical force. They planned an elaborate operation that would convince enemy actors to abandon their mission through careful application of social pressure, misinformation, and emotional manipulation. Harrison's team took a different approach, designing an exercise that would test their ability to maintain tactical effectiveness while operating under complete role reversal, where leaders became followers and experienced personnel took direction from newer candidates. Their scenario explored whether military hierarchy enhanced or limited unit effectiveness in unpredictable situations. As Sarah watched the candidates taking ownership of their own learning and pushing themselves beyond anything she had specifically taught them, she realized that the most important lessons of psychological training couldn't be demonstrated for external evaluators. The real value lay in developing mental habits and thinking patterns that would serve them throughout their careers in ways that might never be visible to outside observers. The third week concluded with each team executing their self-designed operations while other candidates and Pentagon evaluators observed. The level of creativity, integration, and sophisticated thinking they demonstrated exceeded anything Sarah had hoped to achieve when the program began. However, she also recognized that the political battle for program approval would be determined by factors beyond the candidates' actual development. Pentagon decision-makers would focus on measurable performance improvements and clear demonstrations of tactical superiority rather than the subtle mental flexibility that represented the true value of psychological training. The final week of Sarah's program coincided with an unexpected crisis that would test everything the candidates had learned in ways no one had anticipated. A real-world situation developed that required immediate response from available SEAL units, but conventional forces had encountered complications that made standard tactical approaches ineffective. Captain Hayes summoned Sarah to an emergency briefing at 0400 hours on Monday morning, his expression grim as he explained the developing situation. A cargo ship had been seized by pirates in international waters, but the hostage situation involved complications that traditional rescue operations couldn't address without high probability of civilian casualties. The pirates have taken refuge in a coastal facility that's also being used as a refugee camp for displaced families, Hayes explained, spreading intelligence photos across the briefing table. Any conventional assault would endanger hundreds of innocent civilians, including children. We need approaches that haven't been tried before. Sarah studied the intelligence materials with growing understanding of why she had been called to this briefing. The situation required exactly the kind of adaptive thinking and creative problem solving that her program had been designed to develop. However, using experimental training methods in actual combat operations represented enormous risks for everyone involved. Sir, are you suggesting that my candidates participate in a real-world rescue operation? Sarah asked. Not participate, Hayes corrected. Lead. Your people have been training for situations where conventional approaches don't work. This is exactly that kind of situation. If psychological training can produce better outcomes than traditional methods, now is the time to prove it. The implications of this opportunity were staggering. Success would validate Sarah's entire approach and guarantee continuation of psychological training for future SEAL classes. Failure could result in civilian deaths, international incidents, and the end of her military career. More importantly, it would place her candidates in lethal situations where the theoretical concepts they had been practicing would determine whether real people lived or died. The psychological pressure of actual combat, combined with responsibility for civilian lives, would test their mental flexibility in ways that no simulation could replicate. Sarah requested time to consult with her candidates before committing to the operation. She understood that volunteers for experimental training had not necessarily agreed to serve as test subjects in actual combat situations where unproven methods could have deadly consequences. She assembled the candidates in their usual classroom and explained the situation without minimizing the risks involved. You have an opportunity to apply what you've learned in a real-world scenario where lives depend on your ability to think creatively while maintaining tactical excellence, she told them. However, this is completely voluntary. Anyone who prefers to complete the training program through simulated exercises rather than actual operations can withdraw without any negative impact on their careers. The response was immediate and unanimous. Every candidate volunteered for the real-world operation, their eagerness to test their newly developed capabilities overriding concerns about personal risk or career implications. Harrison spoke for the group when he said, "Ma'am, we've spent 3 weeks learning that our tactical training might not be sufficient for every situation we'll face as SEALs. If there's a chance that what you've taught us could save civilian lives that conventional approaches might not be able to protect, we need to find out whether our training actually works." Sarah felt enormous pride in their response, but also crushing responsibility for what might happen if her psychological training proved inadequate when tested against deadly realities. The theoretical concepts that had seemed promising in classroom exercises would now be evaluated in conditions where mistakes could produce irreversible consequences. The next 24 hours were devoted to intensive mission planning that integrated conventional SEAL tactics with the creative thinking approaches the candidates had been developing. Intelligence analysts provided detailed information about the target facility, hostage locations, pirate capabilities, and civilian population distribution. The situation was extraordinarily complex because the pirates had deliberately chosen a location where any use of force would endanger refugees who had nowhere else to go. Conventional hostage rescue protocols required isolation of targets from civilian populations, but the physical layout of the facility made such isolation impossible without alerting the pirates and potentially triggering hostage execution. Sarah's candidates approached the planning process with thinking patterns that had been transformed by their psychological training. Instead of automatically defaulting to tactical solutions, they began by questioning fundamental assumptions about what success required and exploring whether alternative approaches might achieve better outcomes. Rodriguez proposed an unconventional strategy based on psychological manipulation of pirate behavior rather than direct confrontation. His analysis suggested that the pirates had chosen their location specifically to discourage military intervention, which meant they were more focused on avoiding capture than maximizing damage. If their psychological motivations could be accurately assessed and manipulated, they might be induced to abandon their position voluntarily. "What if we don't try to rescue the hostages?" Rodriguez suggested during planning sessions, but instead convince the pirates that staying in their current location has become more dangerous than leaving? This approach required detailed psychological profiling of the pirate leadership, understanding their decision-making processes under pressure, and developing manipulation strategies that would guide them toward behaviors that served rescue objectives while appearing to serve their own interests. Harrison's team developed a complementary strategy that involved social infiltration of the refugee population to gather real-time intelligence and establish communication networks that could coordinate civilian evacuation if psychological manipulation failed and tactical intervention became necessary. The integration of psychological and tactical planning produced approaches that were far more sophisticated than either conventional SEAL methods or pure creative thinking could have achieved independently. The candidates had learned to seamlessly combine their tactical expertise with creative problem-solving in ways that enhanced both capabilities. Pentagon evaluators observed the planning process with obvious amazement at the level of innovation and integration the candidates demonstrated. However, Sarah knew that ultimate evaluation would depend on operational results rather than planning sophistication. The operation began at dawn on Thursday with Rodriguez's team establishing positions for psychological manipulation while Harrison's team initiated social infiltration of the refugee camp. Both approaches required capabilities that had never been part of traditional SEAL training but which the candidates had developed through intensive psychological preparation. Rodriguez's psychological assessment of the pirate leadership proved remarkably accurate. Through careful analysis of their public statements, response patterns, and behavioral indicators, he identified key psychological pressure points that could be exploited to influence their decision-making. His team began implementing a sophisticated disinformation campaign designed to convince the pirates that military forces were planning an immediate assault that would make their current position indefensible. Instead of actual military preparation, they used social media manipulation, staged communications, and carefully planted false intelligence to create the illusion of overwhelming force that would make resistance appear futile. Harrison's team infiltrated the refugee population by posing as international aid workers, using social skills they had developed through psychological training to build trust and gather intelligence without arousing suspicion. Their ability to maintain civilian personas while conducting tactical reconnaissance exceeded anything traditional military training could have produced. The combination of psychological manipulation and social intelligence gathering created a complete picture of the situation that allowed real-time adaptation as circumstances evolved. When the pirates' initial response to psychological pressure differed from predictions, the candidates were able to modify their approach based on new information rather than abandoning their strategy for conventional tactics. After 12 hours of careful psychological manipulation, the pirate leadership began showing signs of doubt about their ability to maintain their position successfully. Rodriguez's disinformation campaign had convinced them that military intervention was inevitable and that their only choice was between surrender and annihilation. At this critical moment, Harrison's social infiltration team provided crucial intelligence about civilian evacuation routes that could be used if the pirates attempted to flee while taking hostages with them. The integration of psychological pressure with tactical preparation allowed the operation to proceed with multiple contingency plans based on different possible pirate responses. The breakthrough came when one of the pirate leaders contacted authorities to negotiate surrender terms. Rodriguez had successfully identified his psychological profile as someone who prioritized survival over ideology and had applied exactly the right pressure to convince him that cooperation offered better prospects than continued resistance. However, negotiations revealed a complication that neither conventional tactics nor psychological manipulation alone could have addressed. The pirates were willing to release most hostages but demanded safe passage that would require them to travel through the refugee camp, potentially creating new opportunities for taking civilian shields. Sarah's candidates responded to this development with the kind of adaptive thinking that their psychological training had been designed to develop. Instead of viewing the pirates' demands as obstacles to overcome, they recognized them as opportunities to guide the situation toward optimal resolution. Harrison proposed allowing the pirates to believe they were successfully escaping while actually guiding them into a controlled environment where final apprehension could occur without endangering any civilians. Rodriguez's psychological profile suggested that the pirates would accept apparent success rather than examining the details of their escape route too carefully. The final phase of the operation required precise coordination between psychological manipulation, social infiltration, and conventional tactical capabilities. As the pirates moved through their planned escape route, they were gradually isolated from civilian populations through a combination of refugee evacuation guided by Harrison's team and route manipulation guided by Rodriguez's psychological assessment. When tactical apprehension finally occurred, it happened in an isolated location where conventional SEAL capabilities could be applied without any risk to civilian populations. The entire operation concluded with all hostages safely recovered, all pirates captured, and 0 civilian casualties despite the complex environment and multiple complicating factors. Pentagon evaluators who had witnessed the entire operation documented results that exceeded every prediction about what psychological training might accomplish. The candidates had demonstrated capabilities that combined the best aspects of traditional SEAL training with creative problem-solving and adaptive thinking that produced superior outcomes in complex scenarios. However, the real validation came from the refugees themselves, many of whom expressed gratitude for the careful attention to civilian safety that had guided every aspect of the operation. Traditional tactical approaches, while potentially effective at hostage recovery, could never have achieved the same level of protection for innocent bystanders. Sarah gathered her candidates for final debriefing sessions that would determine how the psychological training experience had affected their understanding of military effectiveness and their own capabilities. The transition from theoretical exercises to real-world application had transformed their perspective on the relationship between mental flexibility and tactical excellence. 3 weeks ago, most of you questioned whether psychological training had any relevance to SEAL operations, Sarah observed during the group discussion. Today you successfully completed a mission that conventional approaches could not have accomplished safely. What did you learn about the relationship between different types of capabilities? Harrison responded first, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine enthusiasm for integrated training approaches. Ma'am, I learned that tactical skills and creative thinking aren't competing approaches, but complementary capabilities that make each other more effective. The psychological training didn't replace our tactical preparation, it gave us additional tools that expanded our options for mission accomplishment. Rodriguez added his perspective on how psychological training had changed his understanding of leadership and decision-making. The most important lesson for me was learning to question my initial assumptions about what success requires. Tactical training teaches us to identify the most effective approach to achieving predetermined objectives. Psychological training teaches us to question whether those objectives are actually optimal for the specific situation we're facing. Other candidates described how the integration of psychological and tactical training had affected their confidence in handling unpredictable situations. Instead of feeling constrained by established procedures, they had learned to view their tactical skills as a foundation for creative adaptation rather than a complete solution for every possible scenario. The final exercise of the program required each candidate to design a training scenario that would help future SEAL classes develop the same integration of tactical excellence and mental flexibility. This assignment forced them to synthesize their learning experience and articulate the principles that would be most valuable for others to develop. Their proposals revealed sophisticated understanding of how psychological training could enhance rather than replace conventional military preparation. Instead of viewing mental flexibility as an alternative to tactical skills, they had learned to see both capabilities as essential components of complete military effectiveness. Sarah concluded the program with individual assessments that documented each candidate's development of specific psychological capabilities alongside their tactical qualifications. These assessments would become part of their permanent records and would influence their future assignments and opportunities for specialized training. The Pentagon Evaluation Report, completed 1 week after the successful hostage rescue operation, recommended immediate implementation of psychological training as a standard component of SEAL preparation. The combination of documented performance improvements and successful real-world application had convinced even the most skeptical officials that mental flexibility training provided measurable advantages for elite military operations. However, Sarah understood that the real measure of her program's success wouldn't be determined by official recognition or policy changes, but by how effectively her candidates applied their newly developed capabilities throughout their careers. The psychological training had given them tools that would be most valuable in unpredictable situations that couldn't be anticipated or planned for in advance. 6 months later, Sarah received reports about her former candidates from their commanding officers in various operational units around the world. The feedback consistently described enhanced performance in complex scenarios, improved leadership under ambiguous conditions, and creative approaches to mission accomplishment that exceeded expectations based on conventional training backgrounds. Harrison had been selected for advanced leadership training based on his demonstrated ability to integrate tactical excellence with adaptive thinking under pressure. Rodriguez had been assigned to a specialized unit that conducted operations requiring social intelligence and psychological manipulation capabilities. Other candidates were excelling in various assignments that benefited from their enhanced mental flexibility and creative problem-solving abilities. The success of Sarah's experimental program led to expansion of psychological training throughout special operations forces and eventual integration into conventional military education. Her approach had demonstrated that mental capabilities could be developed and enhanced through systematic training just as effectively as physical and tactical skills. More importantly, her work had shown that the most elite military units could benefit from perspectives that came from outside traditional military culture. The integration of academic psychology with operational experience had produced innovations that neither field could have achieved independently. Sarah's final report on the program emphasized that psychological training should be viewed as an enhancement to rather than a replacement for conventional military preparation. The goal wasn't to produce warriors who thought like psychologists, but to develop complete military professionals who could apply both tactical expertise and mental flexibility appropriately for whatever situations they encountered. The candidates who had initially challenged her presence and questioned her qualifications had become advocates for psychological training who helped implement similar programs throughout their careers. Their transformation from skeptics to supporters represented the kind of institutional change that would influence military effectiveness for generations to come. Years later, when Sarah reflected on her experience with the SEAL candidates, she realized that the most important lesson hadn't been about specific psychological techniques or creative thinking methods, but about the value of intellectual humility and continuous learning. The warriors who had been most successful in applying psychological training were those who had learned to question their own assumptions and remain open to capabilities they hadn't known they could develop. The program had succeeded not because it had changed what SEALs did, but because it had expanded their understanding of what they were capable of becoming. In a profession where the difference between success and failure often came down to split-second decisions under extreme pressure, having additional mental tools and thinking approaches could mean the difference between life and death for themselves and the people they were sworn to protect.